We're going to talk a little bit about ETOS and where we are with ETOS at the moment. First of all, we're going to talk what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about what ETOS is shortly, for those of you that hasn't heard about it before or familiar with it. Then Tobias is going to talk about the current state, where we are right now, what we've done the last year or so, and then a bit about the future, where we're going with ETOS. So what is ETOS then? ETOS is short for Eiffel Test Orchestration System. It's a system for orchestrating testing, basically. We started back in the winter of 2018, I think, where we wanted to do more when it came to automated testing at Axis, where we work, and we were kind of frustrated with our current system. It was working fine, but it was kind of limited to not doing the kind of dynamic test scope things and the possibilities to change order of tests running and so on in the way that we wanted to. The system that we had was very focused on one device, one test, and you run everything in a sequence, basically. So fairly simple setup, and it's still used and it's very robust and it works great, but we want to have more possibilities for our testers and for our test automation engineers. So we decided to make a proof of concept of a test orchestration system, some kind of system that would enable us to do more advanced automated testing. And in all of that commotion, we got to hear about Eiffel, and we thought that might be a good way to drive traceability, because we had limited traceability in some aspects of what we were doing. So we set out to do just that, and that went fairly well. We got something up and running, and then we started to interact more with the Eiffel community, and we actually went to the summit. Was it in
2020? Or
2019? No, 19 was in Lund, right?
Yeah, 2020 was in Boston. You were there in Boston.
Yeah, but I was talking about when we first came to Kista, and but that might be was that in 18? Okay, so the same year we started. We work fast, obviously. So we went there and we talked a little bit about what we were doing at the summit, and people didn't seem to disagree with what we were doing. So somewhere around there, we decided that we should probably donate this to the Eiffel community, making it open source, because until now it was totally internal, like not really something that Axis was going for. It's mainly me and Tobias and some other people doing it with our left hands, basically. But then we decided we want to do this. We want to make it open source, and we want to try to push for using this internally going forward. So our mission then was basically to give testers more flexibility, enable dynamic test automation, decoupling of testing pipelines, enable better traceability, and increase speed. Kind of a fluffy, cheesy thing to have, but still it was some kind of a mission. And we started to work, and for I don't really know how we wound up with this, but we created some kind of guiding principles for how testers might want to work with test automation and test orchestration. And it's basically boils down to, you shouldn't have to care about the stuff that you don't know anything about. So previously you had to fiddle with a lot of systems to make things happen that you really didn't care about, and you didn't really know anything about what you were doing in those systems, perhaps. So we wanted to separate the concerns of the testers, basically. So the first part would be to give the test engineer freedom to do what he wanted. He usually wants to he knows what to test, and he wants to run tests, and he wants to focus on the test scope. Basically, I want to test this because of some change or whatever. He doesn't really care much about how the tests are executed or the code or so on. He usually just wants to run tests, and this, it doesn't have to be a test engineer. It can be a developer also running some regression suite or whatever. And the tester basically builds the test suite. So we also have an internal tool called Suite Builder that this is typically the tool that the tester uses to build the suite for ETOS. And the tester has to have some kind of test to run. So that brings us to the test automation engineer and his concerns. This guy likes to write code. He likes to focus on the implementation, the techie details there, not necessarily exactly what is tested and where the test is going to be run, but more of a development focused tester or something like that. And he usually knows how to run the tests, or should know, and that is his contribution to the test suite. And this guy also uses the suite builder, but another part of it, like the part where you specify how certain tests are run. And then lastly, to be able to run these nice test suites that these guys have created together, we need sort of a system engineer or system owner that makes ETOS available, basically. So in our organization, this is basically me and Tobias and another guy named Anders, and we make sure that ETOS is available, and we configure, deploy, manage it so that the testers can use all the dynamic cool features that we have, and we focus on what other people need. So if people wants to do some crazy firmware upgrade, multiple thing test, we make sure ETOS can do that, and they get their test automation engineers to write those tests for them. So that's basically how it works in the background of all. So this is something that's guiding us when we're developing and using ETOS internally at Access anyways. And a little bit more of what it actually is on a fairly detailed level. It's a composition of microservices, basically. Some are not as micro as the word might suggest, but there are separate services that coexist and work together to orchestrate the testing. Everything is currently written in Python, and we run on Kubernetes, and we have a kind of a strong dependency towards Kubernetes. I guess it won't work without Kubernetes, which is fine, we think. Some strong dependencies are okay. And the communication internally between these microservices are Eiffel and HTTP, regular API calls. So it's nothing strange there. And then sort of to describe what ETOS actually does without going into all the details is I'm going to go through some kind of concepts. That ETOS is basically test runners, which are containers that run the tests. And then we have providers that provide different parts of the test environment, because basically what a testing is, you have a test and you run in some kind of an environment. So we have the different providers are execution space providers, item under test providers, and log area providers. And in execution space is so typically where you execute the tests. So in our case, it's Jenkins. Could be Kubernetes, could be something else. It's basically how you configure ETOS to talk to some kind of provider that gives you an execution space area or something like that. Item under test is basically, in our case, it's a device, it's a camera. So that is we have a provider for getting cameras, one or many, connected in different ways. And log area is pretty self-explanatory. It's where you put the logs. In our case, it's Artifactory. So making all this work together is basically you have the container run on the execution space with a network connected to the device, in our case the camera, and all the logs are put out to the log area. And then, of course, all of this, how these things interact with each other is configurable. So that we have created a sort of a configuration language that we can use to explain to ETOS how it should get an execution space and how it should get the device to test and how it should put the logs in the log area and so on. So that's something that is configured. You can configure that in different ways. So you can choose different configurations when running different types of suites and so on. And lastly, slide about what the services are. So it's ETOS client, which is the sort of a CLI client, where you can a convenience client to run ETOS. ETOS API is this entry point for ETOS, and the client basically helps you to talk to the API, but you can use any HTTP client to run it. The ETOS environment provider is where we do, it's the largest part, is where we do all the provider configurations and make ETOS talk to all the different other services that are needed to run the tests. Suite runner is a simple thing tells this, the suite runner, it's kind of a simple thing that tells the suite starter is a simple thing that tells the suite runner to run the tests. It is in place. We created it to be able to do some kind of rolling update thing, but we have actually never used it. So it's just there because basically, and the system works. So we're not going to move it anytime soon. And the suite runner, it runs the suite, tells the execution space that you use this container, which in turn, the container in turn, that is the test runner, runs the tests basically. And there are a few down there. These one, the non-bracketed ones are available on the Eiffel community page. The two at the bottom are still proprietary tools, but we are looking how we could maybe get those out into the Eiffel community as well. But we are not quite there yet, so we'll have to see. And I guess that's a short ETOS 101, and Tobias is going to continue with the current state of ETOS.
Yes. Okay, so the current state will basically be a presentation or just give you some information about what has happened since last time we talked about ETOS, which was the last physical Eiffel summit, where we basically just showed a massive image on all the events that we are sending. But what we have been working on is these three things. The external providers, to give some information about that. Fredrik talked about our configuration language that we have for the environment providers so that we can provide log areas, IoT providers, and execution spaces. What we have added is the ability to just give a URL to the environment provider instead, and just say that to get an IoT, communicate with this API instead. So you can deploy your own service, your own web service, whenever you need to do more complex things with devices, for instance, or with the execution space or with the log area. In our case, we have hardware that needs to get a firmware flashed onto it. So to do that in our configuration language is possible, but insanely difficult to read. So we just separate out to an external provider. Other than that, we have worked a lot with stability. We have noticed that we sometimes closed the connection to RabbitMQ a bit too quickly when we send events. We don't send through RemRem, we send it direct publishing straight to the RabbitMQ bus. Where we closed the connection too early and the events wasn't sent, or there was some hiccup and we never resent the events that we tried to. So we lost a lot of events when we ran ETOS every now and then.
And you also had, sometimes you didn't close the connection and had a connection leak instead.
I was going to come to that.
Yes. Sorry.
As Magnus said, we reconnected poorly without closing the connection. So we just kept connections alive and it increased over time. So we worked a lot on that. And we also have systems nowadays where we can do a shadow execution of the big test suites at Axis. so also in terms of stability. And we have increased the observability in the system a lot. We have a few API calls that we can do and stuff like that. We're not that good with the observability yet, but we'll get better. The adoption rate of ETOS is quite low. We don't know about any other companies that use ETOS. We tried to get Grundfos to use it. Sadly, they don't have the time to actually look into it. It is quite a complex beast to deploy the whole of ETOS. I mean, I think even we have difficulties deploying it because it's just too complex at some point. We do have full support at Axis, but we don't use it in production completely at Axis. We haven't replaced all the ways of running tests at Axis. We are working with that now. The biggest problem there, and the reason we don't have it in production at Axis, is because we are trying to solve a problem that the developers don't have yet. Basically, we can run tests faster, but that speed is not a requirement yet. Probably because our developers haven't felt the awesomeness of greater speed and greater amount of integrations. So that's where we're at right now. For the future, we are looking at something that we call permutation testing. This is actually on our main branches right now in ETOS. We haven't released it yet. The way that ETOS works is that you give it an artifact that you want to test, and then you give a data set. The data set can be anything that the system engineers has decided. In our case, we decide on the hardware that is going to get the artifact flashed onto it in our data sets. What we can do with permutations is that we can have multiple batches in the test execution recipe collection created event. And you can permutate, you can send in multiple data sets. So for instance, one data set with this hardware, one data set with this hardware, and one with this. And then you have 3 batches in the TRCC. And we will run three different tests with different data sets. So in my example here, you would have different hardwares for the artifact. It will also allow for more system testing. We have devices or software that has dependencies between each other, and we can test them as a system instead of testing them one by one. And it also enables sequential testing, which ETOS does not support just yet. We cannot run tests sequentially. We can only run them in parallel. I will not go into detail what that means, but it's a silly bug that is going to get fixed. So this is on our main branches right now, and we hope to get a new release of it at least this year, where permutation testing is available. And next up is to fix the documentation. The documentation of ETOS is mostly targeted at me and Fredrik for deploying ETOS, and not for the actual users of the system. So we need to do improvements of the documentation. It is not correct everywhere, so we need to improve it. And we need to also target the actual users of ETOS. How do you run tests? How do you build a test suite? And how do you use all of these cool features? And we also need to automate this documentation because we are bad at updating it. And even further into the future, we are looking at rewriting ETOS into Golang. And the reasoning is that we have changed programming language in our little team to be primarily Go. So we will look into rewriting ETOS into Go and use the concept in Kubernetes called controllers. So we can actually have ETOS live in Kubernetes and react to new custom resources being created and stuff like that, just to give ourselves some increased flexibility. But the only thing we have on that rewrite and the controller is just some drawings on a whiteboard, so it might not happen. Yeah, and that is the state and future of ETOS. And we have it should have said questions, question mark, but.
Oh, so there are open questions.
Yes.
How is Eiffel actually used here? I mean, is it used to drive the orchestration, or is it mostly used to notify what happens and provide traceability?
Eiffel is mostly used for traceability. The way that ETOS is started is that the ETOS client or a user pings the ETOS API. The ETOS API will then create a test execution recipe, which is what we trigger on. So we trigger on the TRCC, and then after that, it's just traceability. So we send events just for others to see what's happening.
When you send events, yesterday we talked about this with parsing logs and so on. But with ETOS, I guess you don't have to go in and parse logs, but you actually, if you have a test runner, it will send all the test events.
The test runner is a Docker container with our ETOS test runner installed in it, and then it will get the batches from the TRCC, and it will read that with custom fields that we have added, following the rules of the specification of Eiffel. So it's legal. All these custom fields are legal, and then the ETOS test runner will read that description and start tests from that. So ETOS is the one that triggers the tests to start, and then it will read the logs and apply a regex on each line. And if that matches some regex file with rules, then we will send the test case events. So ETOS actually sends it.
Okay.
But we have an update to the internal test automation framework that we have internally, where it will start sending the events instead, and the ETOS will be disabled.
So it's basically configurable depending on what test runner you're using.
Yes. We didn't want to write plugins for all major test runners, so to speak. So for PyTest or for nose test or for Go test or whatever, we didn't want to write any plugins for those. That's why we use regex and the ability to plug in stuff.
And you don't have to consider like sending directly from the test body any events. This is not an option.
Sorry, I did.
Well, I was wondering at which level you were sending the events, either executor or the ETOS, or maybe from at some point from the test body. Since this is for traceability, I was wondering if there's such a need to embed it in the test body as well.
The way we send a test suite started at the start, and then the test suite finished at the end, and then we parse the output. So we start a sub process in Python for the test cases, and then we read every single line from that output. So when a test case has executed, that's when we send the test case events. So we know exactly what happens. So it is real-time test information for traceability. If the regex works, which they don't, but you know.
They did.
Sometimes they do.
It's kind of brittle.
Yeah.
As regex could be, so.
It depends on the verbosity of the test cases as well, or the test case system. So it is a bad way of doing it. We are looking at trying to find other ways of dealing with that information. For instance, in the test execution recipe collection created event, we could actually have each test case defined in that, and then we would send an event for each. But what happens is that we have a lot of setup time for all of our tests. So then ETOS would be twice as slow as the other way of running it. So I won't go into much detail there, but yeah.
So just as a background, in Ericsson, we have implemented actually the sending our Eiffel events in, I don't know what we call it, test framework or whatever. So when the testers write Java code we use, and they write the tests, and that framework then supports sending both started and finished and so on.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing now.
Okay.
Basically.
Yeah, we have a few developers that are creating a plugin for the most common framework at Axis right now.
Okay.
So to move away from, at least internally, using the regexes, and it should be possible to create these plugins and just disable the test case event sending from ETOS. So you can do this with a Java client or Java framework if you wanted to.
Because what triggered that change was
You.
our desire to, yes, me, but primarily the desire to have, the log output didn't always contain the information we wanted in terms of the name of the test suite and the name of the test and whatnot.
Yeah.
But if we hook into the testing framework, we have that information.
Yeah.
Plus, we can get rid of the regex parsing.
Exactly. Excellent. Thank you.